Oh, there she is. Got it. Cool.
And everyone can see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you all for being here today. I want to especially thank my committee for taking this journey with me, my chair, Dr. Savick, Dr. Snyder, Dr. Gillens, a former colleague and friend. I also want to thank my family for all their support. Many of them are here watching this today, and I'm honored that you could all join us. Today, I'm excited to present my dissertation research on how school leaders perceive and use student voice as a culturally responsive practice. For me, student voice is personal. My interest in the power of student voice stems from my own leadership experiences. During my tenure as a high school principal, I discovered the power of student voice out of necessity, watched it transform the culture of my school, and wondered how I could share the power with colleagues. This encouraged me to research student voice and culturally responsive leadership more deeply to validate my personal experiences with student voice. To discuss the purpose of this study, we must first explore opportunity gaps. As seen in this slide, racial gaps continue to persist in academic performance, discipline, and graduation rate. Classrooms are becoming increasingly diverse, requiring shifts in pedagogy and leadership. These demographics indicate the potential for a significant cultural mismatch between students and educators that sets the context for this study, showing why culturally responsive leadership and authentic student voice are urgent needs. Without alignment between students' needs and educators' understanding, opportunity gaps will persist. In other words, more work needs to be done on the part of educators who have not had similar experiences to their students to better understand these differences. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to investigate how secondary school principals perceive and use student voice as a culturally responsive leadership strategy and address the gap in the literature regarding CRSL and student voice implementation. According to the literature, student voice improves engagement and belonging. However, it is often limited to token roles like completing surveys or serving on student council. Scholars collectively agree that unless student voice initiatives move beyond feedback collection to true collaboration and leadership, they risk being inauthentic and perpetuating existing adult-centered power structures. Culturally responsive education supports identity, achievement, and equity, and student voice is essential for making it authentic. Barriers to implementation of culturally responsive education and student voice include deficit thinking, implicit bias, and lack of trust. Culturally responsive school leadership derived from culturally responsive education emphasizes critical self-awareness, inclusivity, and community stakeholder engagement. Without the support of culturally responsive school leaders, it is unlikely that teachers will adopt culturally responsive practices. The literature links student voice and CRSL by showing that student voice is not an optional add-on. It's central to leadership that is genuinely culturally responsive. Few studies connect the two directly, highlighting the research gap my study addresses. The literature on student voice and culturally responsive student leadership informed the development of the research questions for this study. Culturally responsive education refers to teaching and leadership practices that recognize, respect, and leverage students' cultural backgrounds to promote equitable academic and social outcomes. It challenges deficit thinking, centers student identity, and disrupts systemic inequities in schools. This slide shows the evolution of culturally responsive education. It is important to note that the discussion of culturally responsive pedagogy predates culturally responsive school leadership by over 20 years. I grounded my research in the culturally responsive school leadership framework by Khalifa and colleagues. This model emphasizes 4 core practices. Critical self-awareness indicates that leaders must recognize their own bias, challenge dominant cultural norms, and promote social justice by understanding the school experience of their students. Promoting culturally responsive teaching has leaders support teachers' growth in recognizing student assets, revising curricula, and implementing inclusive practices through knowing the students they teach. Creating inclusive school environments calls on leaders to humanize students, value diverse identities, and disrupt inequitable practices and policies. And finally, engaging students, families, and communities in culturally appropriate ways indicates that leaders must build authentic partnerships with marginalized students and communities and resist deficit narratives. For this study, it was also important to develop a comprehensive definition of student voice by considering the different models of student voice found in the literature. Student voice can show up in different forms, from passive data collection to shared leadership. As shown in this graphic, most student voice efforts are low level. The models clarify that true student voice requires power sharing, not just feedback collection. Therefore, school leaders must move beyond tokenism. Student voice is not just about listening, but co-creating decisions with students. The spectrum of student voice activities distinguishes between consultation and collaboration, adult-led and student-led. Students as data sources include activities like students offering constructive feedback and completing surveys. Students as partners include activities like students helping to create action steps for school improvement and planning school-wide social events. And students as leaders includes activities such as students critiquing curriculum and leading peer mediation. These models supported the development of my survey instrument and interview protocol. These are my 3 guiding research questions to address the frequency of use of student voice, the impact of principals' demographic characteristics on the frequency and levels of use of student voice, and principals' beliefs and attitudes about student voice as a culturally responsive practice. For this research, I used a concurrent exploratory mixed methods design. The target population of secondary principals were solicited through social media and attendance at the National Association of Secondary School Principals Conference in July of 2024. Research questions 1 and 2 about the perceived frequency of use of student voice and the impact of principal demographic characteristics on the perceived use of student voice activities were answered in the first phase of the study with a researcher-constructed survey. The third research question regarding beliefs and attitudes of principals was addressed in phase 2 of the study with semi-structured interviews. Using both structured survey data and open-ended interviews allowed for a rich mixed method understanding of how student voice is practiced in schools. To measure how often principals perceive their use of student voice strategies and at what level, a survey was developed as previously discussed. Activities on the survey were categorized in 3 levels: students as data sources, students as partners, and students as leaders. Participants responded to 18 items, 6 at each level, representing a range of student voice activities using a Likert scale to indicate the frequency of use as never, seldom, often, and always. Sample survey questions are seen on this slide. To ensure validity and reliability, the survey was pilot tested before administration. Adjustments were made based on feedback to improve clarity and align with CRSL concepts. To answer research question 3 regarding the attitudes and beliefs of principals, an interview protocol was developed to conduct semi-structured interviews. This protocol ensured consistency while allowing participants to elaborate freely. Questions in the interview probed principals' beliefs about student voice, their specific practices and examples, the barriers or supports needed for implementation, and the connections that principals made between culturally responsive practices found in the CRSL framework and student voice. After transcription, participants were offered a chance to review their responses to ensure accuracy and authenticity. Both instruments were deeply aligned with the theoretical framework, ensuring content validity. The demographics of the 247 principals that participated in the survey are shown on this slide. The demographic characteristics of the survey sample were similar to the national population of secondary public school principals, including the previously discussed reality that most principals are white. As indicated in this slide, there was great diversity represented in the survey sample. And as you can see in this graphic, the 15 principals that were interview participants were also a diverse representation. Data analysis for research question 1 and 2 included descriptive and inferential statistics. I calculated means and standard deviations for each activity and student voice level to identify overall patterns in the perceived frequency of each activity. A chi-square test and analysis of variance were used to analyze the relationship between student voice activity levels and principal demographics. The interviews were transcribed verbatim. Initial coding used keywords aligned with CRSL and student voice concepts, and then thematic coding followed to identify patterns and group responses into meaningful categories and then into themes. This analytical approach adds rigor and ensures that the findings are both statistically valid and richly contextualized. I will now highlight some of the research findings. For research question 1, you can see in this chart, principals most frequently use student voice practices at the lowest level of engagement, where students are treated as data sources, while leadership level practices are rarely implemented. This graphic indicates the most and least frequently used activities for each student voice level, with percentages representing the rate of always and often responses. Specifically, for activities at the student as data source level, students engage with administrators through an open door policy was the most frequently used. The least frequently used activity in this category was students provide feedback to teachers on lesson effectiveness. For the level of students as partners, the most frequent activity was students plan non-academic school-wide activities like dances, while the least frequently used activity was students help adults interpret data. And finally, at the leaders level, the most frequently used activity was students communicate with policymakers, and the least frequently used activity was students lead teacher professional development. As you can see, there's a significant drop in the use of partner and leader student voice activities. As indicated by the circled means in this chart, findings for research question 2 indicated that some demographic characteristics do impact the frequency and level of student voice activities used in by secondary school principals. Specifically, Black principals use student as leader activities more often than white principals and principals of another race of color. Urban principals use leadership level activities more than suburban and rural principals. And finally, veteran principals with 26 or more years of experience use students as leaders activities more than principals of all other experience levels. In summary, while principals report using student voice, it's mostly at the data source level. The most common activity by far is the open door policy, which puts the burden on students to initiate voice. Activities involving shared decision-making or autonomy were rarely used. The quantitative data suggests that principals prefer low-risk, adult-controlled methods of hearing from students. These activities are easy to implement, but limit student agency. This research confirms what the literature suggests. Principals most frequently use students as data sources because they have an outdated definition of student voice as a culturally responsive practice and believe it is culturally responsive to simply ask a diverse group of students for feedback. However, Black principals, those in urban schools, and those with more years of experience report more frequent use of student voice. But even they report using leadership level strategies only seldom. The literature indicates some possible explanations for these findings. For example, Black principals may use more leadership level activities because they often bring firsthand awareness of systemic inequities, deficit thinking, and the marginalization of student voice. The data regarding urban principals could be explained because urban principals who serve racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse populations feel a greater sense of urgency. And finally, an explanation as to why veteran principals use leadership activities more frequently could be that with more experience, principals often gain greater confidence in their leadership, a deeper understanding of school systems, and more flexibility and autonomy to innovate. Data about these groups demonstrates that school leadership isn't just about knowing the models, it's about mindset, context, and capacity. The qualitative interview data that was used to answer research question 3 revealed 4 major themes. Theme 1, the passive approach to student voice. Principals often see student voice as listening or collecting input from students that self-select to be involved. For example, one principal acknowledged limited inclusion when he said, "I think there's a typical student that may be in most schools we look to, your student council officers or your class officers, but I don't know that that captures the whole demographic picture of your school." Theme 2, the power dynamic and hierarchies. Principals acknowledged that students aren't trusted to lead or make decisions. A principal demonstrated the persistence of traditional adult-held authority by discussing how he makes decisions and may consider student input. Theme 3, a strong desire to serve all students, what I call the will. Principals express a genuine commitment to equity and serving marginalized students, but lack clarity on how to do it authentically. A principal discussed how listening, the lowest level of implementation, impacted her school. The kids really knew that people were listening to them. It just really improved the school culture a lot. And finally, theme 4, a limited understanding of culturally responsive school leadership and the student voice connection, what I call the skill. Most leaders hadn't had explicit training on CRSL or shown how student voice supports it. One principal highlighted the need for training by indicating we can only do what we know and what we are willing to try and risk. Principals rated student voice practices highly in belief, but not in actual frequency of use, indicating a belief-action gap. Leadership level activities, students as decision-making and having policy input, were valued but rarely practiced. As I said in my opening, more work needs to be done by educators. Therefore, I would like to highlight a few recommendations. To overcome the passive approach to student voice, I suggest that principals form a diverse student group supported by trained staff to lead DEI initiatives. This group should allow students to identify issues, conduct research, and present actionable recommendations. Principals should implement at least one student idea annually to validate their efforts. To overcome the lack of trust that encourages adults to hold on to decision-making power, I suggest developing a student leadership training program embedded in a humanities class or an advisory course to teach students about school governance, research and advocacy, conflict resolution, identifying and addressing bias, and presenting solutions to stakeholders. To build on the strong will to serve diverse communities, I suggest using student voice to continue to build empathy by sparking teacher reflection with student narratives, recorded student interviews, and critical incidents discussions. The literature shows that teachers respond more meaningfully when they hear authentic student experiences. And finally, to address the skill deficit, I suggest implementing ongoing job-embedded professional development on the student voice continuum and culturally responsive education, including leadership and advocacy. Include students in staff training to build understanding and build relational trust. School administrators also need specific training in student voice and culturally responsive school leadership. These recommendations aim to normalize student leadership, expand adult capacity for culturally responsive practices, and institutionalize student voice as a permanent, equity-driven element of school improvement. In conclusion, I would like to leave you with this. Student voice is essential for culturally responsive school leadership. Leaders need structural support and mindset shifts to maximize the benefits of student voice. Equity and empowerment for all students begins with listening to students. Thank you for your time today. Do you have any questions?